let me begin by asking about Room, because I never got to see it because I was planning to be there on opening night. So you were at rehearsals and you got to see it. What did you think?
Oh, I felt that in the previews of Room, I felt that we got it to a point it had never been at before. I'm particularly grateful to the Grand Theatre in London for giving us a week of development time, long before rehearsals and with none of the pressure to achieve things that you have in rehearsals. We were able to literally get silly. At one point, we were all making masks out of paper bags. So I think we radically improved the play, and there was a new design in the second half, for instance, a totally different set, which really pulled the whole thing together. So an opportunity to rework a play is so precious. It's expensive, but it's so worth it. So I thought they got Room to an extraordinary level. And then it was all just ripped away from us by COVID. And I shouldn't complain because everybody's lost something. But I have to say, nothing during the pandemic has been as hard for me as the cancellation of Room.
Yeah, no, I was very disappointed and upset. I knew something was coming, but I thought there'd be a bit more time, and then it just happened so quickly. That Friday, actually, which was the 13th, it was. So
also, it's been such a blow to theatre makers worldwide and to live performers. Again, I don't want to complain too much of any one production being cancelled, because we have a bigger problem. It's been so hard for those who work through live performance, and there have been amazing adjustments. I've been a keen enjoyer, for instance, of online theatre in a way I never bothered with before. So I've watched live plays and recordings and so on, and it's all better than nothing, but none of it is quite theatre. So I just cannot wait for the day we can gather in theatres again.
In the author's note of The Pull of the Stars, you write that you were inspired by the centenary of the 1918 pandemic, or flu as it was called back then. What was it that inspired you about that? Because you certainly wouldn't have known that it would have been so timely.
Not at all. No, I had no inkling of that. I wrote the entire novel before realizing there was any contemporary relevance. I was on a train to Toronto, and I accidentally left my computer at home. I was on my way to the Toronto International Festival of Authors, and all I had with me was a copy of The Economist magazine, which I usually find a bit dry, but I read it cover to cover. And there was this long article about the 1918 pandemic, and I realized for the first time that it was a modern plague, that this was an electrified world where people were, busily going to work on the tram, that kind of thing, and that everything suddenly had to grind to a halt when this came along because they didn't know where danger lay. They knew to shy away from somebody who was coughing or sneezing, but they couldn't tell in what way the invisible germs would grab them or what their chances were. So I just thought it would make a very sort of almost post-apocalyptic story if you wrote about 1918 in a way that wasn't too hung up on kind of statistics or facts and figures of the day. I wanted it to feel very post-apocalyptic. So in my first draft, I didn't even say when it was set. And above all, what I was trying to capture was the intensity of those times. Because I'm talking about healthcare workers, my novel's about a nurse and a volunteer helper and a doctor in a Dublin hospital. For them, yes, it's a terrible time, but it's thrilling as well. At one point, the doctor during an autopsy says to the nurse, "We'll never learn as much or as fast as we're doing now." And again, the volunteer finds it exhilarating to be really needed, to feel that her simplest actions are saving lives. So I was trying to capture not just doom and gloom, but the kind of thrilling adrenaline of a time where you suddenly realize that you are important.
So it was reading that Economist article, you were intrigued by this notion of the world just coming to a halt. When you said post-apocalyptic.
Absolutely. And one detail, I started researching it immediately on my phone on the train. And one detail that hooked me very early on was the fact I hadn't known that women in late pregnancy or just after birth were the most likely to catch this terrible new flu, and they had the most complications from it. So they were the most vulnerable. And I immediately thought, where did they put those women? They can't have put laboring women into a flu ward, but they can't have put women with flu into a labor ward. So there must have been some little quarantine room arrangement. And I thought, oh, that's where I want to set my novel, because that would be so, confined and scary and high stakes. It would be like setting a novel in the trenches. but it's kind of, the women's war. And Ireland has always had a particularly, had a particular obsession with getting women to have lots and lots of babies. One of the women from the Dublin slums in the novel, she quotes a proverb about, she doesn't love him unless she gives him 12. And I'm one of 8 myself. So I was really trying to capture what it might be like to make babies in a country where really that was how a woman proved herself over and over again.
So that proverb exists. You didn't make it up.
No, I did make it up, but it was based on lots of quotes I read in, say, oral histories of the Dublin slums. Just that often what you're doing as a writer is taking evidence that's already there, but just encapsulating it, putting it in fewer words. So that would be an example where I came across lots of people saying like, oh, if a woman really loves her husband, she'll have lots of children for him. She'll, keep providing for the country and for the church and for the husband. And so I just thought, okay, I'll turn that into a proverb. I'll just, squeeze it tighter.
Well, it's a really good one. I believed it. That's...
Similarly, I put lots of government information notices in the novel, and none of them are actually from posters of the time, but they're inspired by many posters of the time from lots of different countries all over the world, where governments would, they were trying to give good advice to their citizens, but they didn't have a clue. Masks were worn, for instance, mostly outdoors, and then as you stepped into a building, you would take it off. And governments would often sort of vaguely guilt trip their citizens. They would imply that if the citizens were kind of weak-minded and mentally frail or defeatist, the germs would get them. Or if the citizens failed to seek out fresh air and sunshine. And I'm thinking, you're living in Dublin, in a slum, how do you find fresh air and sunshine? So just like nowadays, when so much of the advice seems to be aimed at the rich,
Yeah, no, and in the novel, that it comes through very clearly that, those people living in slums, there was nothing they could really do. They were stuck.
Yeah, and poverty is a pre-existing condition, and pandemics do not move at random. Pandemics attack those who we have already chosen through our political decisions. We've already chosen to have those people be defenseless.
Yeah. So, I noticed a lot of some similarities between this novel and some of your earlier ones. The sense of space, you said it yourself, just confine them.
I do tend to lock them up. Yes, I feel bad about this. Yeah, in fact, when I was writing Room, I realized for the first time that every novelist is the captor. We've taken these characters and we've put them in conditions that will increase conflict and tension, and we have limited their resources. I mean, for Room, I was literally shopping for the kidnap situation on IKEA. I was choosing like cheap and nasty furniture, and I was choosing, 5 books each for Man, for Jack, and more than 5. So I felt bad, but I realized that in a sense we do this every time because we don't want our characters to have a comfortable life. We want story. We want to squeeze story out of them.
Yeah, I get you need conflict, just like the theater, right? You need conflict. You have to put them in the most extreme situation, and certainly in this case, that is true. I think you say something like the main character who narrates the novel says something like that the whole world had ground to a halt. Everything had stopped, and in fact, that's very true now. That's how it feels.
Doesn't it? And I try to use a lot of mechanical vocabulary because it's early 20th century, and I think people saw things very much in terms of the machine. Sometimes they glorified the machine, a movement like the futurists in art. It was all about, the thrill of the pistons and the wheels. But at moments like the pandemic, it would have seemed like, we're living in a rusted up machine, that we're trapped in cities and structures which only work as long as everyone can keep moving and keep mixing. And suddenly they become landscapes of terror when, the more people are around you, the harder it is to go for a walk without coming within 2 meters of everybody. So our kind of, urban progressive visions of life suddenly turn nightmarish as we're thinking, so many people around me.
Yeah, it's weird. The other thing that struck me, the other similarity is the one of the main characters, the volunteer, Bridie. That is how you pronounce her name, right?
Yeah.
She's childlike because she actually has been. she hasn't matured to the level that she could mature, because she's an orphan, and she's an orphanage run by nuns who have other ideas as to what these orphans should do. And then she comes to life in this situation where all of a sudden she has a purpose, and she realizes, and the nurse realizes, she's very intelligent and has great instincts, and knows what to do. It reminded me a bit of Room, and
I suppose hardship can bring out great strengths. Yes. I mean, I've always assumed when reading stories about World War II that I would have been the timid kind who neither actively betrayed her neighbors to the Nazis, nor did she save them. But I could be wrong. Who knows? I've honestly never been in a situation that would bring out that kind of strength in me. Bridie is the only character I've ever written inspired by a government report. I know this seems odd, but Ireland locked up a huge percentage of its population in residential institutions of one kind or another, from Magdalene hospitals where fallen women or Magdalenes were sent to be reformed, reformatories, orphanages, so-called industrial schools, but they didn't really teach them any industry, and orphanages and mother and baby homes. And it's funny, in Canada we tend to see this entirely through a racist lens, as in white people were locking up native people. But in Ireland, we did very much the same kind of thing, but basically locking up the poor. So it's interesting to see those same toxic dynamics playing out in the country, in the history of different countries. So in Ireland, I wanted to see whether somebody like Bridie could come out of what she calls the pipe, that system of these institutions. Very much, damaged and hurting. She's always been made to feel useless, for instance. I didn't choose any of the more lurid examples from the big government Ryan report on Irish residential institutions. I chose the milder examples of where somebody would be rebuked for having red hair, for instance, or told she was useless, or she'd be for sneezing in mass, something you couldn't possibly help. So I wanted to see whether somebody could come out of that system, starved of everything we think kids need, and yet with her own kind of resilience and with her own funds of energy and curiosity and plain good sense, which might suddenly show themselves in a situation where she could flourish. And even if that situation is an unpaid job where she's completely untrained, as an extra pair of hands, she is managing to save lives in that room, and having meaningful work for the first time is just exactly what this young traumatized woman needs.
And then there's another character who is actually based on someone who lived, and that is the doctor.
That's right, Dr. Kathleen Lynn. I was not looking for a real person to put into this novel. It's way easier to write about invented people. But when I was researching Irish doctors of the 1910s, I came across Kathleen Lynn, who was simultaneously a very innovative doctor and had a huge concern for the poor, set up a free flu clinic, for instance. But she was also a suffragette, and she was also in Sinn Féin, trying to achieve freedom from British rule for Ireland. And she'd been involved in the 1916 Rising, and she was on the run from police during the time my novel is set in. So I just thought, okay, I can't resist her. She's extraordinary. And I knew she would give a sort of broader intellectual context to the things coming up in the novel, and that she might have a kind of a mentoring effect on my nurse. So I wanted to make a kind of a chain of these three people across the sort of status spectrum of a hospital, from a doctor through a nurse down to an untrained volunteer, to show them affecting each other and all in their different ways, kind of really coming alive during this grueling time.
Yeah, in a grueling time. Is it 3 days or 4 days? I can't remember.
3 days, yeah, just 3 days.
I mean, a lot happens in those 3 days, and the novel feels like a thriller. I mean, you want to know what's going to happen next, and because it's first person narration, the sentences are short, and paragraphs sometimes are just one sentence. So I
really tried to make the style very spare and bare bones to go with the feeling of like no time to waste, so I did a lot of going through, reading every sentence aloud and seeing which words I could do without. I don't try and cultivate a sort of house style for myself. I really try and adapt the voice and the style to the particular story I'm writing. So that way each book is a different challenge to me, and it kind of keeps me on my toes,
well, the spareness of it just added to the thrill, the speed of how everything happened, and boy, yes, it really is. To use an old-fashioned term, a page turner, because you're flipping the pages trying to find out what happens next, and you don't have, because the paragraphs are so short. Sometimes I find myself in that kind of situation, reading at the first sentence of the paragraph and the last, and then skipping ahead because I'm anxious to find out what happens next. In this instance, that wasn't the case. You could read every sentence.
Oh, I'm so glad it worked for you, John. Because I focused the whole book on childbirth, I really wanted to tap into the kind of narrative possibilities of childbirth, in that it's very unpredictable. It's not an illness. It can be absolutely fine and routine, or it can be a grand drama, and it can be a crisis that kills the mother or the baby. So it's wonderfully unpredictable in its storyline, childbirth is. And you could have things go splendidly and then suddenly horribly, or vice versa. So I think it's a rather unexplored area in fiction, and I really enjoyed this chance to kind of take childbirth and reveal it as the kind of thrilling drama it can be.
Yes, and certainly the story has ups and downs and twists and turns, and in the end, we do know, because it was 1918, they did get over this.
It's very comforting to me to have worked on a pandemic story set in far worse times. I mean, really, scientists hadn't a clue back then. They were looking for a bacterium, and they didn't know that it was a virus. They didn't even know what viruses were. So by comparison, we are so much better equipped. We know what's happening. It's mostly a matter of, the painful difficulty of having to obey the rules. But we are in much better condition than they were in 1918. And it's very comforting to me to see that we can get through horrendous times.
You would know more than I, because you've done the research, but my understanding is what happened with that flu is that all of a sudden it lost its potency.
It's weird. It does seem, after 3 terrible waves, the middle one being the worst, it just suddenly pretty much went away. And there's so much we don't understand, no matter how much it's been studied. And it's funny, we all sit around predicting these days, don't we? When is a vaccine likely? And there remains still so many unknowns. And it's quite difficult for people who are used to, planning their lives. I'm a big planner myself. I do kind of 5-year plans, like a Stalinist, telling myself what things to write next and setting out my ambitions. And, for there to be some unknowns, like when can theatres run at capacity again, it's very difficult to just stay in the moment and try and do your work when so much remains completely unpredictable.
Yes. So it's and I'm glad the novel came out early, because I think it was supposed to be published next year.
That's right, but I think by next year we might be really thoroughly sick of pandemic stories.
Yes. But now to see it as, it's in the background, but it does drive everything that happens in the story. And it really is about these women, these remarkable women who step up and do whatever they can. So it's in that way you could read the novel and get a sense of what a pandemic is and what effect it has, while seeing these characters, these fascinating characters who were in many ways living ahead of their time.
I really tried to capture not just the sheer stamina of healthcare workers and their kind of improvisatory skill, and their ability to work with what they knew, even when there was so much they didn't know. But I tried to capture their dark humor as well. So one of the many books I found really helpful, Brian Goldman, his books about modern emergency wards, he's got one called The Secret Language of Doctors, where he talks about all the little, sometimes quite sneering, jokey phrases people use to get through the grind of having to staff an emergency ward. So I think healthcare workers probably in every era have been wisecracking their way through this, and whatever it takes to keep them going. Good luck to them.
Oh yes. So and the novel is very specifically set in Dublin, in Ireland. So you get a sense of that society, which was going through a seismic change as well at that time. A few years later, they finally had independence.
That's one reason I said it in Ireland. I knew I could get the authentic voices right, but it was also that, it was a society in such upheaval, and they went from most people being shocked to hear of our 1916 rising. You know, suddenly there was gunfire in the streets, and lots of people were loyal to the king and saying, "What's all this nonsense?" And a few years later, everybody was voting for independence. So I thought, how can a society change that fast? But you know, I've been looking around me in the last few months and seeing how, you know, the crisis conditions of COVID have led to, say, an astonishing kind of international take up of the questions raised by the Black Lives Matter movement. So actually I'm seeing how much things can change in times of crisis, and it's kind of extraordinary, and there are many things to be thrilled about, even as there's so much to lament.
Yes, no, that's what comes very clear in the novel is in this crisis there were lots of other opportunities. People had their eyes open to all kinds of other things. So if there's a silver lining, I guess that's it. So, well, thank you very much. I hope lots of people read the novel. I certainly will read it again, actually, because there was a lot I didn't take in because I just wanted to find out what was going to happen next. And we hope to see Room on the stage as soon as we're allowed to gather again, as soon as this is over. And again, it'll probably be nice for it to start at the Grand and then come to Toronto.
That would be fabulous. Thanks so much, John. This has been lovely.